Welcome to Sport Media and Tech. I'm Keel Blake, and on this episode, Dr. Jeff Porter, Mark Hotchkin, and I spend time with two professionals who are using data to drive the sport safety and science industry forward. Please stay tuned to listen from Dr. Robb Rehberg, CEO and founder of Sport Safety International, and Dr. Phil Wagner, CEO and founder of Sparta Science.
The first question we want to ask both of you is, how did you get your start in sports safety?
Wow. Well, for me, it came kind of naturally, as a byproduct of my profession. I started off as an athletic trainer working in a high school, but in particular, sports safety, and really sports safety, I think, in my career has been kind of a subdiscipline of sports medicine. Really came from seeing how many injuries that I've come across, not only as a high school athletic trainer, but as a consultant and in other areas, and how many could be prevented with education. And so that's really where I began, kind of in the latter years of my career, really dedicating, what I do and the work that I do to sports safety in particular, just knowing the injuries that are out there and knowing how very simple things that are done in terms of prevention and education can really eliminate a lot of injury.
For me, I think very similar to Rob, being exposed to the amount of injuries that occur in sports. I think for me personally, I was a college athlete and injured in quite a variety of different, unique, and creative ways, it felt like, and pretty shocked at the inability to identify why it was happening. So went into strength and conditioning only to find the same thing as a coach, that other athletes were struggling with the same idea. So I think being exposed to this concept that, injuries are continuing to accumulate in athletes and really prevent so many individuals from actually being able to compete or play on a team.
You guys have both really talked about what, injuries could be prevented. And you've noted how, based on your background as a coach, as an athletic trainer, simple things, right? Can you talk about what some of those simple things that you've discovered in your practice are to help alleviate some of those kind of preventable injuries?
Well, I think through the course of history, even if you look at, one of the courses I've taught is history and philosophy of sport. And even in ancient times, there were simple, or what seemed like simple fixes for things like, I just saw something recently online that a colleague shared with me about a prosthetic that was created during Egyptian times for an athlete. When you think about how long ago that was and how we are now with developing supports and braces and all those types of things. And all along during history, we've had ways of taping or strapping or finding a way to stretch or a new method. And I think of it in particular, with athletic training and a lot of exercise science now, and most of it really is evidence-based, when it used to be anecdotal, right? Where it used to kind of be like, hey, we're just going to see if this works. We'll use some of this horse liniment and see if that works on somebody's muscles today. Or, and I always think about that as kind of, back in at least in athletic training, I think about especially the 50s and 60s was kind of like the Wild West, where, your athletic training room was just a laboratory, and you were just kind of figure out and see what stuck. And now we have a lot of peer review evidence and a lot of research behind some of the things we do. But whether it's been, the advent of using taping or bracing or different ways of stretching or, adding strength and conditioning over the years. I mean, there were many years where that was not something you wanted to, baseball players wouldn't go to the weight room. Why would they do that? They wanted big muscles, and that was the only reason you went. But that gets to the next part of, I think, innovation for sports safety, which is education, right? A lot of this education comes from trial and error. It's come over the years from research, and I'm sure Phil would agree with this too. The research and the information, the data is coming faster and faster and faster now, and it's creating a lot of opportunity for us to use that data to make athletes more resilient, to prevent injury, and our role here, at least at sports safety, is to use some of that in terms of education, to educate not only the athletes, but the coaches as well about better methods, about ways that they could change, very small things that they do that can make very big gains or prevent injury altogether. And to know that, if they can identify injury and recognize it first, that doing something immediately can have a better outcome later on than just ignoring it. So Phil, I don't know what you think about that in terms of the data part of it, but that's been something that's been real interesting to me lately.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, I agree that the exponential increase in data and technologies in this space has been, rapid and seems to get faster, by the month. And so, yeah, certainly when it comes to education, I think that has now been outpaced by data and technology. And so in a way, the education is becoming more important because of how fast the technology and the data is accumulating. It's outpacing our ability to actually understand it and use it. And I think one of the interesting trends is, in a way, when it comes to technology, you're almost seeing a backlash because people have had experiences with data that's just collecting information for the sake of collecting it. It's not being used. And I think part of that is athletes are now becoming more aware of that and are questioning, hey, well, why are we collecting this if it's not going to be used, or if it's not really helping us make decisions, and why use it? So I think that's where the education piece, across a lot of different areas, the individual athlete, but also certainly the practitioner, that education, I think is moving to the forefront as the major barrier for future growth here, and really leverage safety. How can we better leverage this data and technology? We may not need more of it anymore. We just need to understand how can we use it better. And I think, a great example is, as we've seen this huge rise in data and technology, the injuries also are rising, right? So, that seems to not jive a little bit, right? If we see this tech and data go up, we should at least see the injuries holding or slightly going down, which isn't the case. So I think there's an incredible opportunity for education across all the different stakeholders with these sports organizations.
You mentioned kind of those injuries and things like more data points and maybe a trend that you wouldn't expect. But something that's interesting to me on this is, how do you manage, I think you hear a lot about data for performance and kind of balancing the performance side of it. Obviously, every athlete wants a competitive edge. I imagine it at some point sometimes could conflict, or at least be a little bit confused with the safety side of things. But how do you balance those two, really important things with what you both do?
The fact that a lot of times is missed is, the higher you perform, the more at risk you are, period. Like I probably run a 5.5 40 right now. There's no hamstring risk there. I'm not going fast enough. Like, it's just not going to happen. And, analogy we use with our athletes is, that Ferrari's got to get serviced a lot more than the Prius, and so, I think it is where data can be helpful, is that what thresholds do we start crossing that line of, we perform at such a high level that the individual's at a greater risk that outweighs that performance increase, right? And that's where data and objectivity can help give insights of the odds of when that starts to shift into a negative, net gain, right? And I think the education for the athlete is important, and the practitioner, that, like, look, we can continue to drive these squat maxes up, but at what cost, right? Are we doing that? Because ultimately the best way to perform better is to be on the field. Like, that's the step one, right? So we at least got to be on the field first. And I think that balance is a critical piece for tech.
Yeah, I agree with that. That the performance gains that we see as a result of what we know also come with the challenges of the new and unforeseen things that happen that we didn't expect, right? And so I see, from a practitioner's perspective, there were so many, for years it was, you go to a conference every year and you learn something, or you'll read a journal quarterly, but there's so much information to stay on top of now. We learn more about this I did, for instance, and I'll take it back to concussion, which is really one of the areas of expertise for me. And that's, I put together an evidence-based graduate course in concussion a couple of years ago, and it was all going to be evidence-based. And so I did an exhaustive literature search on what peer-reviewed papers had come out in the last 2 years, and I stopped counting at 500 peer-reviewed papers in 2 years on concussion. That's a lot of information to digest. And, the challenge certainly is how how do you digest that into something that's actionable, something that actually really is helpful, and not just a bunch of numbers and statistics. And that's something that can be real easy to to kind of forget that we have all these numbers, but these numbers, they need to mean something, right? They need to be able to be put into practice.
So that brings me up to two questions I really want to kind of get your 2 cents on. The first one ends up being, are you finding in your day-to-day that there's a fine line, and Phil, probably for you, a fine line between peak performance and peak and optimal performance and that injury rate, right? Because being an elite athlete, like, we know we're going to push our body to a certain level, and there's got to be a fine line between what that rate, like that sweet spot of what that optimal performance lies in. And the second question, and Rob, you kind of alluded on this a little bit, there's so much data that you're conceptualizing. How are you processing all that data, one? And then two, what data are you actually looking at to help you and your team and your staff kind of figure out how to prevent some of these injuries?
Yeah, I think, that fine line between performance and injury, I think, is interesting because it really varies by sport. Your sport of track and field, right, is probably the most difficult because you're training for a short event, right? Once, right? And you're not going to do that same event, at least not in a competitive level, multiple days in a row.
Correct.
Right. So performance, Jeff, in your case, right, it was so much difficult of that line of where you tip over into an injury risk. But back to that 40-yard example, I think with a sport like football, where they start training like track and field, it's dangerous because they're not track and field athletes. They've got to play every single week. And so therefore, having a 90% is good enough. Right. Running a track race, unfortunately, 90% isn't good enough. Right. At least maybe get away with it in the heats. But, that's, and even baseball, to use an extreme example, 75% is good enough. A lot of pitchers said, hey, the way I reduced Tommy John is I realized that throwing 90 miles an hour was just fine. I didn't need to throw 98. Right. And it allowed me to stay the whole season if I stayed in that third or fourth gear and not pushed it. And I think that's ultimately where data and numbers provide insights for and thresholds, if you will, just like a car. When do you start redlining it? Right. You've got to know based on these numbers, okay, at this level is when you've crossed that threshold of you're producing so much force, you're producing so much output that now your tissues are at risk if you've got to repeat that event day after day or week after week. And what are those numbers really are dictated by two things: how you relate to yourself, compared to weeks past, but also how you relate to your peers. Like what is the average output of a football player? And then what's the average output for you as a football player? And then taking that context of yourself and the context of you versus your peers, you get that number, that context of where you sit. That allows decisions to be made, and a lot of times hard decisions of like, we've got to pull back today because we've got to make sure we don't redline you. And I think a lot of times that's tough for athletes that always want to compete. But I mean, you see it, in the great ones. There wasn't this concept of load management, the Michael Jordans, the Derek Jeters, right? The Tom Brady's, like they operate in that sweet spot very well between performance and injury, and manage their outputs, without technology. But how can we take the knowledge that they innately have, and how can we have technology provide those same instincts, to youth, to high school and up?
And to the other part of your question, Jeff, about all that data that's out there, and there's that old saying, and I don't know who said this, but there's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics, right? And so we can use statistics in so many different ways, but that's one of the great things that I love about at least about this profession, the sports medicine and sports science, is the collaboration between professionals and trying to figure out consensus among what it all means, right? And so again, when I think about concussion When I think about all the science that's going on out there, and when we have a consensus statement or a position statement in our professions, which really are guiding documents that say, here's a bunch of experts that did a meta-analysis of all the research that's out there, and what is the best way to address this today with what we know and what's in the research, and being able to come out with those things. And I know when I graduated from college, there were exactly 0 position statements on anything except for maybe CPR. Now I know in my own profession in athletic training, we have 24 position statements on everything from concussion to management of ankle sprains, conservative management of ankle sprains, to nutrition and weight loss and everything in between. And that's good. That's not too much information, because all of those consensus statements and position statements, and a lot of them are interdisciplinary. It's not just athletic training, it's all other aspects of sports medicine. All of them help us understand a lot of the data that's out there. My only observation is that we probably need to update position statements a lot faster than we used to, because the data is, by the time it gets to print, it's already outdated, right?
Well said, Rob. And Phil called it earlier, and Rob, you said it. I need a position statement. I did lunges yesterday and did some leg presses, and today I tried to run a mile. And Phil, you called it my hamstrings were on fire. So I need some information on how to make sure I'm not overtraining in that way. But with that in mind, the next question is speaking about injuries, what are the most common injuries, or what puts athletes most at risk, or coaches, at all levels, right? So at the amateur, high school, collegiate, and pro, what would you say are the most common injuries?
Well, I can say, from my perspective, we focus on a lot more of the emergency and catastrophic type, injuries. And I know Phil can talk a lot more about, some of the musculoskeletal and overuse and even the, acute, musculoskeletal things. But for us, it doesn't matter what level it is. We've been primarily focused on concussion, prevention of exertional heat illness, sudden cardiac death, and the prevention of sudden cardiac death. And now, believe it or not, one of the things that we're paying a lot of attention to and is on the, the tip of everybody's tongue, and that's COVID and preventing disease transmission in sports. And that's something that oftentimes people don't think of as an injury or illness related to sports, but it most certainly is. It can shut down an entire team. It can make athletes obviously incredibly sick. It can also have, there's a growing body of research that's still addressing, the relationship between COVID and other types of flu-like virus and cardiac-related conditions. And so for us, we focus on those, and concussion, heat, cardiac. Those are the big ones for us. Those are the ones that it doesn't matter whether you're a young kid or an elite athlete, you can still fall victim to any one of these under the right circumstances. And that's really why we focus a whole lot on education and prevention in those areas. But I know Phil probably has a little bit of a different perspective from all the work that he does with some of these other types of injuries.
Yeah, I think, most of our issues are on the less, acute or traumatic side from what Rob had mentioned. And certainly I think we're, those areas are of the utmost importance because they tend to have a little bit more catastrophic consequences. From a musculoskeletal side, where we tend to focus, there's generally a biomechanics issue, not moving well, put risk too much on a certain structure, or it's just an overuse, doing too much. People like to do lunges and then go run a mile, right? For example, right? Just picking an example out of the sky of how overuse can happen. I think what continues to amaze me in this era of data and technology is ACLs, are continuing to increase, right? And, thank God we didn't approach measles this way, because, we've been able to eradicate some of these diseases, but we just haven't been able to do that with these musculoskeletal issues, with ACLs. And I think a lot of it is because there wasn't a data or technology to identify the individual reason why. And with ACLs, 20 years ago, it was like, okay, I got it. It's because females have wider hips. That's why they all have more ACLs. And then 10 years ago, it said, you know what? It's actually because quads are over powering the hamstrings. And then more recently, it's like, well, it's actually trunk position. Females aren't as strong in the upper body, so they're more lean forward, and therefore it's more risk on the ACL. The answer is D, all of the above. It just depends, like, well, is it the architecture, you have wide hips? Is it a quad hamstring? Is it a trunk? And it really depends on the individual. And I think that's the opportunity for data and technology, is to really identify, okay, why are you as an individual, why are you objectively at a risk for an ACL? And how can we actually address that with a plan, whether that's different exercises or movement patterns, to really offset kind of some of these innate issues or accumulated issues that athletes have. But I think, back to your original question, ACLs certainly are, at least in our mind, top of mind with these common injuries. And then we still see quite a few soft tissue injuries. Even that week one of the NFL season, I think there were around 40 hamstrings, in that first week. And, a lot of that is just exposure to high speeds, and during this time of COVID, we can do all the home training we want, but no one's running routes in their backyard, with live defensive backs and live quarterbacks to replicate those high speeds. So when we are exposed to those and the body's not used to that exposure, we've created a landscape where there's an increased risk for an injury. So I'd say the soft tissue, hamstring, and ACLs are kind of top of mind in these musculoskeletal areas for injury.
I want to take a kind of a step back and hear a little bit about both the organizations that you work with, Robb with the Sports Safety International and Phil with Sparta. So Robb, why don't you lead us off? Just tell us a little bit more about what you do, what the mission is, and how you provide solutions.
Sure. Yeah. So Sports Safety International is largely an online operation. We've been around for, I think, just about 11 years now, and our goal is to promote safe participation in sport and physical activity through education. We serve really two different targets. On one side, it's parents, athletes, and coaches, and we provide educational programming primarily online. In areas like cardiac, sudden cardiac death prevention, concussion, prevention of exertional heat illness, and now, of course, COVID. And then on the healthcare provider side, we do have continuing medical education programming for athletic trainers, physicians, physical therapists, and nurses on more or less what the standard of care is. And so the way we got started is a colleague of mine and I, who was also an athletic trainer, we had been doing a fair amount of work as legal experts. And, I've done actually a lot of expert witness work. And, one of the common themes, especially with concussion, and I got to do a lot of concussion and cardiac related cases just because those were kind of my area of expertise. And, one of the things we realized is that all of these cases and all of these injuries could have been avoided if there was just a little bit more education on many different levels. And so we initially started by providing education, for our clients as we did some of these expert cases, and found that we got a lot more satisfaction in the prevention aspect instead of people calling us, after the fact when they wanted to sue somebody or defend themselves in a lawsuit. And so we started concussion education as a free education program for coaches, and then we developed one for athletes and one for parents. Then we got a call from the state of Pennsylvania and said, hey, we loved your concussion course. Can you do one like that for sudden cardiac death? Because we have a bill that just became law and it requires education and nobody's got education. And so we did one for them, and that was nationwide. It's used a lot else in California and a few other states. We did one for heat illness. The COVID one just came out recently, but we've now trained over 1 million parents, athletes, and coaches around the world in 52 countries with our educational programs. And 99% of those were free education that we've offered. And so we've been pretty excited to have at least a little bit of an impact. And again, it's real easy as a practitioner. Again, I've worked at a high school as an athletic trainer, worked at college. I also work in a hospital-based concussion program, and now at the NFL. And you'd think we've been talking about these types of issues, the ones that I mentioned that we have education for years. Everybody must know by now what you should and shouldn't do, if your kid hits their head, or if they're feeling fatigue on, excessive fatigue after exercise, or, if it's a hot and humid day out when they should exercise. But the truth is, people still need to be reminded of this information. The first-time parents and new youth sport coaches who are the mom or the dad who are first-time coaches, and even athletes themselves do need to be reminded about this. And, and that's why, it is worthwhile. We're excited, when we hear the positive stories about, about the education that we've done and how it's helped people. And as a whole, I mean, I've seen it even, in the few years that I've worked with the NFL. When I first got involved and was involved in concussion, you could not get a high school athlete or a college and certainly not an NFL athlete to self-report symptoms of a concussion. And we see that now more than ever now. We're seeing more and more NFL players who are taking themselves out and reporting to their medical staff and saying, you know what, something doesn't feel right. I have a headache, because they understand what's at stake. And that's in large part of everyone who's played a role in educating and really getting away from, the old way, back when I played football, where, you didn't come out at any cost, no matter, what body part it was. And so that's what we aim to do at Sports Safety. And every day is another opportunity to educate. And we do have some premium services that we offer. We have a mobile app that we've made for coaches and also for healthcare providers that has information about injury and illness and how to get help and when to see a healthcare provider. But I think the greatest satisfaction I get is every day I get a kind of a running tab when I'm online of how many people have taken our free courses, and it goes up every day, and we see those spikes before every season. But that's what we do at Sports Safety. We're here to educate and help keep people in the game and preventing injury.
On the Sparta side, Sparta is a movement platform, that houses assessments and standardizes them across organizations. So there's a normative database of like, okay, what does healthy football players look like versus, females that are at risk for an ACL that play soccer. And so really have collected, at this point, hundreds of thousands of scans and assessments using a force plate. And that comes from either a balance or a jump or a plank. And so these assessments are then gathered and associated with outcomes, which can be both performance-based in their sport or injury-based, hamstring, ACL, and is able to make sense using machine learning of what patterns and outcomes are likely to happen, and therefore provide meaning in terms of, okay, at this threshold, that's where your performance is maximized, but beyond that, you're at risk for an ACL. So here's the things to do to balance that out and reduce your risk. But the whole idea of aggregating standardized assessments into a central de-identified database for injury prediction and reduction is what we offer and provide sports organizations.
You guys kind of alluded to this, but I want to ask the question, kind of get a deeper dive into this. We all talk about data, we've talked about education, but what type of innovative technology are you guys using in your day-to-days that you start to see that could be useful in your, helping the athletes, helping the coaches, helping the parents kind of mitigate and alleviate some of these consistent nagging injuries?
We're constantly trying to find ways to better educate, and not just, it's a voiceover, a PowerPoint that's boring. I mean, even with COVID, now that everybody's using video and we're all on Zoom and talking, boy, listening to a screen with some words on it is a real drag, isn't it? I mean, nobody wants to do that anymore. So trying to find a way to gamify things, trying to find ways to use technology so it's kind of a choose your own adventure type of thing. Johnny, hit his head on the goalpost in soccer, and should he report it or should he not? And he can go down one story or another. And so using those type of educational tools in a way that meets, people where they're at, whether it's the busy parent who's also a youth coach, or whether it's a 12-year-old whose attention span for something that, is not on the Xbox is really short. Those are the types of things that, that we really do from an educational perspective. Before I throw it over to Phil, though, one of the things that I am involved a little bit with is helping with project management in the NFL with some of the injury reduction programs, and especially with ACL and hamstring, I do some support there. And, between some of the force plate stuff, like what they do at Sparta that Phil does, and some of the, the wearable technology that's out there brings treasure trove of data. And what I'll say, Phil said this just before, and I think it's really worth kind of kind of highlighting again, is that, when we work with concussion, we would, and I use this analogy forever, if you and I broke our arm the exact same way, doing the exact same thing, we probably have the same outcome. We put our cast on our arm, in 6 to 8 weeks, cast comes off and our bone's healed, right? But concussion, you and I could hit our heads the exact same way, doing the exact same thing, and have two completely different experiences. And that's really true. Every concussive injury is like a fingerprint. There's no two that are the same. But with all the information that we've learned from data and a lot of the things, a lot like what Sparta does and what Phil does, is that exactly like he said, not everybody gets a hamstring injury or an ACL injury the same way from the same thing. They're all individualized. It has a lot to do with so many different factors, and being able to identify per player, by the type, by their body type, by the imbalances they have, by the type of position they play, by the type of footwear that they're wearing, by the surface, the day, the time. I mean, it really is amazing to me how we're really fine tuning per athlete, not just saying we had a hamstring and it's probably because of this, or an ACL because it's one of these things. And I know Phil could probably talk for days on that stuff because that's really what he does, but it really is fascinating to me. So I'll leave that for you, Phil.
Yeah, and you mentioned, obviously Sparta, but Wearables, kind of look at it like two buckets, like your external load and your internal load, or just more basically your cause and effect, right? And there's kind of these two areas of technologies which are really important. One is how much load are you placing on the system, right? Which can be a lot of times GPS is an example of a wearable used in sports, or heart rate monitors, right? Or even as simple as how long was the practice, right? How many minutes was it? How much did you run in it? And then you've got your internal load. We think we play a role there. And okay, with that loading, how did you respond? How are you producing force? How's your balance? And so those two paired together are really important because you get that cause and effect, because a lot of what we've been talking about, Rob mentioned it, is there's such a varying response from the individual. So you really need both, because even the same load placed on an individual, the same practice, is going to cause a different response from two individuals. And so you want to know both, okay, what was placed on the individual and how did they respond? External, internal, cause and effect. And I think sometimes, only one is chosen. And so it's important to have both to avoid the assumptions on the other end. And it can be so simple as, RPE, what's called rating of perceived exertion. You give a 1 through 10, how hard was it? 10 being brutal. And, that has even outperformed heart rate monitoring, for individuals in terms of its ability to measure how difficult, exercise or a session was. So there's also cost-effective tools that can be effective to monitor the different response rates between individuals. And so I think those two kind of categories, should be the headline a lot of times of approaching from a data standpoint, this sports safety space.
Yeah, the space as a whole seems like something that's really kind of evolving and growing. You hear much more conversation about it now than you did even 10 years ago. So my next question was kind of about the future of the industry. We have a lot of people who are in the sports industry, have an interest in technology. If they're intrigued by this space, what are the opportunities for growth? How can different people in the industry play a role that maybe aren't doctors or aren't just athletic trainers? I get the sense that it's something that a lot more people can contribute to. So curious what areas of the industry you see growth in the next few years.
Yeah, at least for my end, you certainly don't have to be an athletic trainer or even a healthcare provider to be involved here. I mean, we have, I even working, with the NFL, just seeing the number of, engineers and biomechanists and data science people and coders and programmers who are putting together the algorithms that help sort out a lot of this data that comes in. Educational specialists, people that specialize in online education. I mean, there's so much that goes into When I think of the final product athlete, whether it's a high school athlete or a Division I college athlete or a professional athlete, the athlete of today moving forward and into the future, there's a lot that went into getting that athlete to where they are. And it's not just buying I remember, when it was time to play football, I went out and got my mother brought me, I bought a pair of cleats and, got handed a helmet and shoulder pads, and that was it. We'd have some captain's practices, but there's so much more that goes into that now at every single level. And it's education. It's developing that education. It's understanding the research, putting out the recommendations, and putting those recommendations in terms that an athlete can understand and buy into, which is a real important part, as well as parents and coaches, and also making sure healthcare providers understand what the latest is, what they should be doing. It's small things that healthcare providers can do that can have a tremendous impact on their athletes, and developing those things takes all different disciplines: educators, scientists, healthcare providers, practitioners, physicians. I mean, we could sit here and probably, if we had a whiteboard here, put a list of 20 to 30 different disciplines that all have some role in sports safety, and putting these types of programs and services together that make it so different than, when I talked about this 50s and 60s, about that being the Wild West and there not being any research, it makes me think that when I grew up, it was the Wild West compared to some of the things that we're doing now and what we'll even see in 10 years.
Yeah, and I think we touched on it before too. I think the data and technology has eclipsed our ability to understand it all. And that's an absolute just fact that I get convinced about every day, more and more so. And so if that is the case, that there's a gap of what's available and our ability to understand it, just means there's also a ton of opportunities for people to get involved, to close that gap, and that can be, everything from graphic designers of how to better relay visually, through education, how to change habits or, understand concepts, to, Rob mentioned data scientists, right? To actually figure out how to simplify what metrics are the best to look at. But I think at the end of the day, there's so many opportunities, and really it's how can we better gain alignment within an organization, because everybody's education has been upskilled through different means. And I think the other thing to bring up is, we talked a lot about individual responses to exercise and training. There's also individual learning styles, right? So we can easily create a visual for one individual to learn, but another individual may be an auditory learner, right? And so also having different mediums in order to convey these stories, these educational pieces, I think really opens it up for anybody who wants to get involved. I think it's more, what are you good at, right? And once you figure that out, then really focusing on that area to help close the gap, because everything's really needed at this point.
That's really good advice. And, both of you are performing, I'd say, at the highest level in this industry, working with some of the, top organizations, leagues, and teams. And, you specialize in different things, but I think there's a lot that could be learned from both of your organizations in terms of where the industry is going around sports safety. And so one of the traditions we have here in closing out our podcast is for our guest panelists to look right into the camera and share some advice for the students. And, this is, come full circle, Rob. I think it was 3 years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where you actually you gave me this coin here from which you reminded me, a quote from Lou Holtz, but it's life is 10% of what happens to you and 90% of how you react to it. Yeah. I think that stands very true in the time we're in today, but also with the opportunities that we have ahead of us around sports safety. So I'd just like to ask each of you to close out with your advice for the students. It doesn't have to be sports safety related; it could be life.
Sure. Well, hey, I'll say follow your passion. Follow your passion and what you love to do, and don't take no for an answer, but be prepared to put the work in. The quote, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you react to it, is one that I learned probably in my early 20s. And I'm not a big quote person, but it completely changed my life. and my outlook on life. And, it doesn't matter that COVID happened. It doesn't matter that something awful happened in your life. It's what you do next that matters, right? It's what you do every single day, and that you keep moving forward and do something. So I tell my students that, every day, and every one of my students gets one of those coins, and I tell them, not only should they really think about that every day. Okay, I'm not doing well in this class. Well, what are you going to do next? You can't just sit around and go, man, I wish I'd do better, or hope that some, magic wand is going to, someone's going to wave a magic wand and make things better. You have to create your opportunities. You can't wait for people to create opportunities for you. And you have to keep going one day after the next and really keep moving towards what your goal is. And some days you're going to move faster than others. Some days you're going to feel like you're moving backwards. But as long as you always remember, it's not what happened, it's what happens next. It's what you do next. And if you can remember that, and you can take that a little bit every single day, eventually you'll get to where you want to be. You'll get to where you want to go. So I guess that's where I leave it there. It's the best I can give you.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, certainly that passion is huge, particularly with facing adversity. I think I'd kind of add on to that and say just being very comfortable with being uncomfortable, and that really putting yourself in situations where you're going to be uncomfortable, because that's where you're going to learn. You're going to learn what you like, what you don't like, what you're good at, what you're not. And a lot of times that's, I think hands-on experience is what's going to a lot of times put yourself in that position, and learning from others within organizations in the trenches, because ultimately most organizations are looking for people to help. It may not be a glamorous role initially, but it's a way in, and know that it, through time and integrity, there'll be opportunities. But it's going to really kind of to seek those out and seek out those moments and those places to be uncomfortable, because that's where those breakthroughs and those learning lessons are going to be, provided.
And that's a wrap. Join us next episode to talk about immersive experiences with Dolph Burley, the CEO of Topgolf.